So we're going to dive right into the discussion. Even though it's been several weeks after the election, there are still conversations going around the possibility that maybe the 2020 election was rigged, that it was hacked, that it was stolen, or that it was the most transparent and safest election in the past several years. So we're going to try to get as much diverse as we can. We have two excellent panelists, which I'm pretty certain are going to have different takes on the election. So first question to you, Michael. Do you think that it is, well, first of all, thank you for accepting the invitation. Thank you so much. Do you think we can still credibly have a debate? I mean, I know you accepted to go on here, but how much can we change the conversation, bearing in mind that all the courts have already dismissed so many of these lawsuits? I mean, to you personally, was the election fully done by the books and honest, or was there room enough for suspicion?
No room for suspicion. Let me thank you again for being on your show. I'm excited to be on your show, and I love coming on your show as often as you want. Basically, I go on Fox News and CBS News, but I'm excited to be on your show as well, so I'm happy. So when we talk about whether there's a legitimate debate again or on this, I don't want you to take it personally, but rating it along the lines of the JFK assassination conspiracies, the moon was staged, I think we're starting to approach that area. There were 50 cases. The lies coming out of Giuliani's mouth, he didn't even have the guts to file in court because it would be a fraud on the court, possibly criminal. Giuliani now faces disbarment from the state of New York. All the courts rejected it. You see the Supreme Court with very perfunctory no. We will not hear it. We will not hear it. Twice the U.S. Supreme Court blew it off. We felt like they couldn't just completely ignore it, but it was practically one word no. So I don't think any election is perfect. It's impossible involving human beings. You have Republican and Democratic election judges at every precinct throughout the country. There's a lot of mechanisms. Any ballot that's suspect can be thrown out, and it happens every election. So I love being here. I guess I did have some doubts because I don't think there should be a legitimate debate at this point. There are 50 court cases that were quickly thrown out. It was beyond embarrassing. These people can't even spell correctly. Law firms were dumping former President Trump. I mean, this is astounding. A president who's unable, as you see, he had 5 lawyers quit for his impeachment trial just a week ago. All 5 quit because of the ridiculous things he was asking them to do. The lawyer who represented Bush v. Gore successfully says this is a joke, lifelong Republican. This is really destructive to our country. It is a farce, actually, that people are trying to attack our democratic system, in effect.
Okay, Sal. Now, what do we have on the other side of this aisle? What do you have to say to that?
I assume I'm the other side. Good to be here.
Yes. What does the other trench have to say about this heated discussion?
Sure. Well, I'm glad, Michael, that you mentioned JFK, because that was the last time an election was stolen. And actually it was stolen in your hometown of Chicago. And that is not controvertible at this point. Anyone who studied political science, my major is in philosophy, politics, and economics from the University of Pennsylvania. You, I believe, went to the University of Chicago. Everyone knows the Daily Machine, with the help of certain individuals, I won't classify in pejorative terms, helped John F. Kennedy steal Chicago and the state of Illinois from Richard Nixon. Richard Nixon decided at the height of the Cold War to put his country first, something he never really got credit for, but he did what some would say is the honorable thing, but perhaps maybe not the best thing in terms of the long-term functionality of our democracy. So first, let's cease and desist from this notion that in order for someone to say that an election was stolen, that person must dabble in conspiracy theories, because it wasn't conspiracy theory. And I'm sure had Richard Nixon done what he was within his right to do in 1960 and say, hey, something's not kosher here, I want these ballots inspected, I want the Daily Machine inspected, I want to take this to court, he would have been within his rights to do so. But I'm sure the Democrats in those days in 1960 would have used the equivalent of quote unquote fake news or conspiracy theory or alternative facts to describe him and his supporters had he done what he was within his legal rights to do. In this case, in 2020, there is just as much a preponderance of evidence that something has gone afoul in this election. Trump did exercise his right. He did not win in court. That doesn't mean he wasn't right. And there's a plethora of statistical evidence to suggest that what you saw on election day and the few days thereafter, by the time this election was decided in favor of Joseph Biden, was somewhere in the realm of statistically highly improbable to statistically impossible. And I'm not going to get into the ad hominem attacks as to whether Donald Trump's a good person or a nice person or gets along with this one or that one. There are all sorts of reasons for which people fire lawyers and lawyers fire clients. But I'm more interested in discussing the math of this election, because too much reeks, too much runs afoul of basic logic and basic statistics.
Let me.
Okay.
Yeah.
I think that the election between JFK and Nixon is a noteworthy and important example. I'm very glad that you mention it. There was election fraud, by the way, and too many people don't know their history. And I'm not a fan of JFK because he was also a liar. He was telling the truth about the missiles in Cuba, but he was exaggerating the missiles in Cuba. Eisenhower knew the correct intelligence, and he lied in that campaign. And the Cuban missiles, actually, this very, very few people understand, were not the imminent threat JFK implied, because they're intercontinental missiles for that time, not in the 70s, unfortunately, so badly outgunned the Russians, the Soviets. But you're right. And I guess the name you didn't say is mafia, Italian mafia. The Chicago outfit was probably held daily. Daley was not considered democratic, particularly lowercase d. He had some unseemly friends, and I hate to, tarnish somebody who's seen as a hero, JFK, but his father was a Nazi. The Kennedys were close to the mafia, by the way. It's nothing to do with the fact that a lunatic shot him, and it was tragic, but I think we overly glorify JFK because that he's not necessarily at fault that Illinois election was not the most honest. We might be only talking about 1 or 2%, though, in Illinois. That tilts the balance. It's unfair. By today's legal standards, Nixon may have had a legal case early on quickly, partly because we have legal standards. Nixon, so if we overly glorify JFK because of his good looks, he was definitely a better looking person than Nixon. I mean, I think I can say that even as a guy, because that was just what he was famous for, he and his wife, but also the horrific death. I mean, the death wasn't just assassination. His head was blown open in front of his wife. It was horrific. So if we overly glorify JFK, we also sometimes overly tarnish Richard Nixon, who often acted with a great deal of honor throughout his career as a politician, even in the way that he resigned after he was caught taking part in a horrific criminal conspiracy that did threaten our democracy. And I would fully ascribe honorable motivations to Richard Nixon, who was a trained lawyer, very intelligent lawyer, and understood that there is a risk in attacking our election system. So while he did have a legitimate case in Illinois, probably not really in any other state. And we're talking about a very close election in Illinois, and we're talking about fraudulent criminal activity. And as a result of those kind of scams, and there's other changes, that was 60 years ago, there are all kinds of safeguards. Yes, this was an unusual election because of the pandemic, and mail-in ballots were at much greater numbers than ever. That introduces new risks, but our system does have all kinds of safeguards. And the issue of claims of statistical irregularities, that's just false, bordering on, frankly, nonsense. Trump outperformed all the polls, and except for the last two presidential, not by much, but it wasn't like huge margins in the, the close states. And except for the last two presidential elections, the polls have been closer. So that's surprising. Also, Republicans did better than expected in the congressional races, and they actually decreased their disadvantage in the House of Representatives. So they actually won in House races. They did better in House races, better than expected, in the states like Georgia, where Trump ultimately lost. Trump is a president who is disliked by the American people to unprecedented terms, and this began before he was elected. He was lawfully elected, of course, in 2016, but Hillary Clinton won millions more of the popular vote. And while I'll defend our system, we have to follow a system. That means something too. And clearly, President Biden won by an even bigger advantage in the popular vote. And we know after 2016, Trump engaged in conspiracy theories claiming that millions of votes in California were fake votes. It's incredibly nonsensical, the things that he has spouted.
I'm going to have to cut you right there because you are getting into other territories that I would love to discuss, like Hillary Clinton and the 2016 election. But before we move on, I want to mention the fact that Dominion Systems has now sued Rudy Giuliani, Sidney Powell. They're seeking $1.3 billion in damages. They're suing Fox News for $2.7 billion in a lawsuit over all these voting machine fraud claims. And they've sent letters to Sean Hannity, to Newsmax, and all that, because they say that it's just lost them a lot of money, and it's just really bad propaganda against them. And at the same time, when I started hearing the lawyer, the Sidney Powell, how she was talking about how these machines were connected basically to Chavez and Venezuela and the Chinese, and just really painting a picture that I just think is really pretty much falling back on already a pre-existing suspicion. I mean, I've heard how Tim Canova, who was a candidate first for the Democratic Party and then as an independent, how he has routinely gone on many discussions saying that his election against Debbie Wasserman Schultz was completely rigged, how there were problems with it, and how these machines kept coming up with only suspiciously 5% in so many districts. So like we already had like a history, and obviously the election in 2020, like the surrounding political climate just made it all much murkier and just scary. Look, especially because, depending on which media outlet you listen to, you either think it was a very good election or a really bad one. But do you guys think that that there is a possibility of ever gaining the trust? Like, will average citizens ever have full trust with these machines, bearing in mind that they keep talking about switch votes and all of these stories that you've all heard, and that, yes, that to my knowledge, most of these have not been able to been verified. What do you guys think about the machines and our current system?
Well,
some don't have trails.
Michael just filibustered, and I have so many responses, but I'll speak to that point first. I'm not here to say that the media...
briefly say that before we get into the machines, because we're just going to be changing stuff. So briefly address what he wanted, what he touched, and then just finish my answer.
Well, there's no brief, and that's the whole point. The media wants two-line sound bites in summation of hours and hours of testimony and evidence. And if anyone were serious about analyzing the 2020 election, they would follow they would heed the advice of Senator Ted Cruz and actually have a congressional committee like we had a 9/11 commission and lay out all the evidence to bear. Michael is wrong when he says that this election was completely clean, and statistics show that. Michael didn't run for office. I've run for office twice. I know very well that there's a cottage industry in politics called the absentee ballot industry that is fraught with fraud, is practically a criminal enterprise, especially in Miami-Dade County. And I've had such individuals come to me when I first announced to run for office, offering their services. And their services go to the higher bidder, and sometimes they take money from both sides. Okay, so absentee ballots, and this goes back decades, is known, okay, for being the most fraudulent element of voting, or most fraudulent mode or form of voting possible. Whether it's the boleteras in the old age homes, bundling the ballots, whether it's people stealing ballots from mailboxes. And the Democrat Party went out of its way to use and abuse the coronavirus pandemic to make sure as many people as possible voted by absentee ballots, I believe, to lay groundwork for the possibility of that fraud. And I believe we have statistical evidence that such fraud existed. And if you'd like, I could go into that evidence.
I mean, okay, for the absentee voters, mail-in votes, that's an important issue, and there is legitimate concerns. I never said it was perfectly clean, by the way. There's no such thing. I mean, there's always risks, but you have FBI, local police, and state police in many of these states, and that's particularly true in Georgia and Pennsylvania. Even having been in Florida for 10 years, I'm not going to express much faith, unfortunately, in the Florida system, though I've been here for 10 years, and Donald Trump did win in Florida. He did very well in South Florida. The Cuban and Venezuelan communities particularly were more taken by him, and I think that was a backlash against the shutdown, for example. And Donna Shalala worsted it because she's on tape saying she likes socialism. I think that's not quite what she meant. And also saying, shut it down, shut it down, shut it down. And I think that came across to people in South Florida as socialist. I don't think that was popular. Donald Trump won in Florida. We have Republican Secretary of State and governor adamantly saying that they voted for Trump, and he's lying. And he threatened them. And what we're actually seeing is a criminal action by the President of the United States to try to threaten them with criminal prosecution to overturn an election in Georgia. And this is a part of a pattern of criminality with Donald Trump. He's always been associated with the Italian and Russian mafia. This is just, in fact, a fact, an absolute fact. Everyone who knows him knows that. The other thing is, when our system is implemented lawfully, and all the courts say that, even if you think it was inaccurate, we are honor-bound and duty-bound to follow election. And I make this argument to liberals as well. If Bush, well, for example, if Bush had won by 50.1% or 49.9%, let's say in Florida, it doesn't make Bush or Gore, for example, far more morally, ethically, empowered to be president ethically just because they won by 300 votes. So at some point, if somebody gets many votes, it becomes close to a coin toss, statistically anyway. But this is not a particularly close election. As, by the way, Senator McConnell pointed out, this is not even a close election. He spoke before the Senate. Senator McConnell, the majority leader at that time, 2 weeks ago of the Senate, said this was not a particularly close race. Even if you think the other guy won by 10 votes, frankly, I will make this argument, it doesn't make him more morally entitled to the presidency. So we do have to accept when half of voters vote for one guy and another half vote for another guy or woman, it's kind of a coin toss.
Michael, your conclusion is predicated on a lot of assumptions, and the main one is that there was not systemic absentee ballot fraud. And I believe both the anecdotes and the statistics bear out the notion that there was systemic absentee ballot fraud committed in this election, particularly in Pennsylvania and Georgia. And I think, Yadira, you should commandeer this conversation and talk about statistics. I don't want this debate to be about Donald Trump's persona. I don't want this debate to even be about Donald Trump.
David, what? The reporters, political activists, law enforcement, they can track down these absentee voters and ask them, did you vote? Who did you vote? Well, that's protected who they voted for, but you can check the ballots. You can track them down.
No one is going to take the time to call hundreds of thousands of individuals, okay? Some of whom may have voted in 2 states. Maybe they don't want to be tracked down. But I mean, just look at the statistics. Will you agree with me, Michael, that it's statistically probable for all the following things to happen at the same time? 1, Donald Trump does better than Hillary Clinton. 2, Donald Trump does better than Obama ever did. 3, Donald Trump increases his turnout amongst African Americans in at least most, if not all, swing states. 4, Donald Trump increases his turnout amongst Jewish Americans in most, if not all, swing states. Next, Donald Trump increases his turnout amongst Hispanic Americans in most, if not all, swing states. And at the same time, he loses by so many millions of votes.
Wait. That is Biden increased his turnout as well. This was an unprecedented election. And
so let's talk about Georgia. Okay. So let's compare apples to apples. So in 2016, Hillary Clinton got 69% of the vote in Fulton County, Georgia. Biden got 72.6%. Okay, I highly doubt Biden is much more popular in Georgia than Hillary Clinton. But let's say you think so many Democrats moved in to Georgia between 2016 and 2020. Here's the issue. When you actually go to the Fulton County website and dig down into the numbers, which I did. Okay, in Fulton County in the 2020 presidential election, 150 different precincts had Biden receive over 90% of the vote. That is statistically impossible in a close election. In DeKalb County, Georgia, 94 precincts had Biden receive over 90% of the vote. Half of them over 95% of the vote. Again, a statistical impossibility. Why is this happening? There have been thousands of such anomalies in this election, so it's no longer anomalous.
The state of Georgia, who's Republican, would have admitted it. They did not have a vested interest in confronting Trump and saying he's a con man. It's on tape. They said, Mr.
You're assuming they don't have a vested interest. Half the party wants Trump gone because Trump changed the game on half the party. But I'm not going to get into conspiracy theories or ulterior motives. I just want to get into the math. The math does not add up. And when you add to the fact that the absentee ballots for Biden were 2-1, okay, which just shows that the vast majority of people in these counties miraculously voted by absentee ballots, which again are more prone to fraud than any form of voting. It all adds up to massive absentee ballot fraud in this election.
The Democratic Party encouraged people to use mail-in ballots, and Donald Trump, to the detriment of the Republican Party, discouraged.
I understand that, but not to that extent. And I don't think it's a surprise that you see these vote dumps. I wish Yadira had the chart. You probably can't see. I'll hold it up for your viewers. Okay, never in the history of politics have you seen vertical lines. Okay,
none of this evidence was presented to courts. None of it.
Michael, that is not true.
But
the court rejected these cases on the grounds of standing.
50 plus.
I would have loved for the court to have allowed all evidence aired, just like Ted Cruz suggested, on air for everyone to see. There should have been a commission like there was for 9/11. There was not.
Well, when Ted Cruz and his fellow Republicans ended up with these discussions on the Congress, on the floor, we kind of saw that this ended in the Capitol riot. So the last time that they got together and started seriously debating this, it did not end so well.
You're conflating two separate issues. Okay,
no,
how people respond
to
facts and facts are two separate issues.
There was no evidence. And Ted Cruz is not exactly considered a more honorable leader than Senator McConnell.
I'm not interested in ad hominems, Michael. I'm here to talk about facts and statistics.
Lied when he said there was no evidence. You're saying Senator McConnell lied, the Secretary of State, Republican of Georgia, lied.
They never said there was no evidence. They said there was not enough evidence to overturn the election, meaning there was evidence. They just believe it did not rise to the level of overturning the results.
I want to go back to what you said, because you brought up some numbers from Georgia. The last I heard, Georgia had recounted its votes like 3 times. How many other times did they do it? It's
irrelevant to recount it if you don't know if the ballots were. You cannot always track down the ballots. They discard the outer envelope in many of these states. Okay, and they're not going to take the time to call all these individuals by the millions who voted by absentee ballots. That's nuts.
Right, but look, when you do hear about certain anecdotes. And I'm trying to be as impartial as possible on this subject.
You election fraud, you go to prison. How many people? Sure. And it happened in isolated cases in North Carolina. It happened to be Republicans, but I don't want to say, oh, it was Republican. It's only Republicans. But you go to prison. It's not 1960 when
Michael, you go to prison if you get caught. There's an entire cottage industry that's existed for years. Most of these people do not go to prison. I know some of these people.
But
one of them actually was arrested.
FBI. If you know these people, call up the FBI. If you know
snitch on them.
Why aren't you calling the FBI? Then you are complicit in the crime.
You're assuming I haven't, and that's all I'm going to say. But let's go on.
But I mean, I'm being serious. I'm not trying to nail you, but you know, these kind of half logical arguments. You're saying you know people, explicitly people who commit election fraud. That would violate Florida and federal law. I mean, and you know,
if somebody tells me they did something, they will deny it, first of all. Okay, they'll say it's puffery, but it's common knowledge in the political world, okay, that absentee ballots are stolen from mailbox. The ballot tellers go to the old lady with arthritis and say, oh, you have a hard time moving your hand. Let me fill out the ballot for you. This goes on and on across the country, especially in Miami-Dade County. Well known.
County with Donald Trump won rising numbers.
Of course, I'm just mentioning that because I happen to have lived in Miami-Dade County for most of my time in Florida. That's not the point. The point is, if I'm personally privy to it, we have other people personally privy to it in different counties all across the country. There are YouTubes about there's an entire election that was overturned, okay, in a small township because they're actually able to call all the people who voted, and they found out the votes were switched.
You are a country of laws. You have to present evidence. No evidence was presented.
That is not true. Evidence was presented. These cases were not heard on technicalities such as standing.
No, the judges said, federal and state judges said that there was no evidence. You can find it. It's court.
No, they said there was not enough evidence to overturn the election. And frankly, if you were a judge, I don't know if you want to be assassinated for being known as a judge overturn.
Right, assassinated because it's part of a big conspiracy against Donald Trump. It never happened against any other president. Donald Trump is a great leader. He attracts assassinations and nobody else has. It's all a big, great conspiracy.
Again, these are ad hominem attacks. I'm speaking logically based on the map. We've never seen a vertical line vote dump in history.
Life. Donald Trump, who spent 10 years in the Howard Stern show, magically has all these conspiracies against him. Maybe that's why all his companies went bankrupt.
Okay, the Howard Stern show has nothing to do that we have graphs showing a vote dump in Michigan and Wisconsin. A vertical line I have not seen in all my years studying politics or being a political consultant or running for office twice. No one has ever seen such a vertical line, Michael.
Republican or Democrat experts have found these patterns you suggest. There are political experts that some are more aligned with the Republican Party, some Democratic Party, some that are neutral. None of them found it. We have crazy QAnon people claiming there was a conspiracy. We are not seeing credible experts from the Republican Party who are bona fide experts saying, yes, this is right. They are embarrassed by this. Senator
Michael, you have thousands of affidavits, on top of all the statistics, you have anecdotal evidence that backs up the statistics. Thousands of affidavits, including from this Indian woman, I wrote down her name so I know I'm going to butcher it. This was in Detroit County, Michigan. Her name is, you can look it up, Hema Kolangireddy. Okay, Hema Kolangireddy was presumed to be a Democrat because Democrats are presumptuous and they presume all minorities are Democrats. So she was treated with kid gloves when she was a poll watcher. She actually had Republican credentials to be a poll watcher. She testified that all whites, particularly white males amongst the Republicans, were humiliated, taunted, physically escorted out, not allowed to poll watch. She was allowed because presumably she was a Democrat because she has dark skin, and she saw countless irregularities, okay? And that's just amongst the tables that were able to be viewed. Most of those tables were not able to be viewed because the vast majority of Republican poll watchers were illegally forced out of the building. This happened in Philadelphia. You can see the video, it's notorious now. This happened all across the country. Never did the converse or inverse happen. Never were a bunch of Democrat poll watchers otherwise.
I'm going to step in and argue that
discriminated on systemically at election poll places.
I'm sorry, say that again?
You're saying that white people face systemic discrimination at poll places.
No. Don't put words in my mouth. I'm not speaking transhistorically. Specifically in this election, there are thousands of affidavits, and there's also video proof. Look at Philadelphia, how they were banging on the window, of specifically and exclusively, or almost exclusively, Republican poll watchers being escorted out of the building when some cases they even had permission from the local sheriff confirming whatever credentials they had to be a poll watcher.
Give me a minute. I want to add that there actually there were live streams where people could tune in to watch these people that were moving the envelopes around and doing the stuff. And so I'm going to say that the only thing that the one credible criticism that I found was the one where these observers couldn't be close enough. I understand that half the town cannot fit there, so we'd have to see just how many of them wanted to get in, and with what style, no Capitol riot kind of style. So I'm going to say that one's the one that is kind of like the most suspicious, because it would be good parallel to the system, the network that many of these centers had installed where you could live stream it and actually had cameras there. And I don't think anybody's going to be wanting to risk years in prison for just switching one or two votes, which at the end of the day, many of these anecdotes, like the most famous ones, when you add them all up, it's never quite enough to really sway the election results. I mean, when you take into account, this person in this county and this other person, they're all small numbered anecdotes, the ones that we have credible, undeniable proof to. Now, I want to read,
Yadira, I mean, one of the things that's really frustrating about this is you had a press conference by a Republican election official in Georgia where he went through examples where people said, this happened in video. And then he gave the greater context. He said, well, this is what happened. And he spent like an hour national press conference. He wasn't the Secretary of State below it. And he went through the examples. And it's so frustrating how people will see something on YouTube, a 10-second clip. A Republican election official in Georgia would go through the time of explaining what actually happened. And then people keep repeating lies. I mean, there are so many lies. There's just
Michael, have I lied to you today? Have I lied to you today? Have I lied to you today?
You're talking about very specific examples, but we look at the court cases where the judges, federal and state, multiple jurisdictions, said there's no evidence. We're looking.
They never said there's no evidence. They said there's not enough evidence to overturn the election.
They said there was no evidence. And what's interesting
and
is,
for the sake of our democracy, we should all see the evidence over a 10-day period. Okay, so they're not casting aspersions upon each other and making this argument an ad hominem attack on Donald Trump.
Giuliani had many things that he didn't even have the guts to file in court. If these things were true, he would have filed in court. And he's still, as Yadira points out, facing a multi-billion-dollar defamation lawsuit. And he's being sued because the company knows that these are lies. The only thing that might protect Giuliani and Trump is there is a higher level of protection for speech related to campaign, because that's not just freedom of speech, that's campaigning. And there's a fear that's a slippery slope that you start to attack Republican and Democratic candidates if if they start to face defamation, whether there's merit or not. So there's actually a higher threshold. That is the only way Giuliani's going to get off here, is the higher protection that goes beyond regular freedom of speech for campaigning if it's thought to be freedom. It is full of lies, and it's a pattern, unprecedented pattern, and you cannot in a million years compare Trump to President Nixon, who 99% of the time acted with great honor. There is a pattern of lies with Donald Trump for his last 4 years, throughout his business career. People really understand his businesses, know it, and you cannot escape the fact he claimed that the Republican Iowa caucus was rigged because Ted Cruz won and he lost. This is a pathological sore loser. And
people like Yadira have claimed that the system was rigged against Bernie Sanders. These people are not necessarily lying. I'm not interested in having those conversations. I'm interested in having a factual, statistical conversation for the sake of the functionality of our democracy to determine whether this election had been rigged and what we could do about it going forward.
I mean, I disagree with Yadira. That's an interesting thing about Bernie Sanders, but I would understand the factual basis where she came from, but I would enjoy that debate on a different day, by the way. I don't think it was. But there is a factual basis that the superdelegates, clearly the DNC, favored Hillary Clinton. I don't think that was illegitimate or immoral, though it superficially appeared. That's an interesting argument. Bernie Sanders may have faults, and I may disagree with him on most of what he says half the time, but he's not a liar. George Bush wasn't a liar. Barack Obama wasn't a liar. Okay, he said you can keep the doctors, and people repeat that a million times, but try to find the lies he said, or President Bush. And they really didn't. People think that mistakes were lies, and they were not lies.
Michael, two facts can be true at the same time. You could hate Donald Trump, and you could think he's a liar, and he could have also legitimately won this election, and it was rigged / possibly stolen. Okay, I'm not interested in Giuliani's
election rigged against the Republican president, where the Republican congressional candidates did far better than expected. And
why is that, Michael? That supports my narrative. That feeds into my evidence, because there were tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of relatively empty ballots where only Biden's name, only the president was voted for, and the down ballot was left blank. That's exactly my point. Because if you're going to rig an election, you don't have time to rig all the local elections.
We know.
But that can be argued. No, but that.
We know that. He ridiculed a war hero, John McCain, who was a Republican presidential candidate. My dad was in Vietnam War. His Parkinson's that he died of 4 years ago is considered to have been caused by the Agent Orange. My dad was in Vietnam. Donald Trump was a draft dodger, ridiculing a guy who was tortured.
So was Bill Clinton. I'm not here to discuss the bona fides of Rudy Giuliani or Donald Trump. I want to discuss the functionality of this election and what we do going forward to make sure our elections are worth voting for, that they're free and fair and statistically non-aberrational.
He is fighting on safeguards for the election, but we also have to understand that 2016 election was an upset. But Donald Trump also won by the smallest of margins in states like Michigan and Wisconsin, the smallest of margins. And he got lucky once. And, there is an element of luck to every election. Bush got lucky in 2000. If the ballot wasn't confusing in Broward, Gore would have run, and we do have to accept it. So our elections are not really perfect, but the lawyers that have been making these claims, including Giuliani, are repeating many lies, and they're not serious lawyers. They're not serious election experts. So, and I think I'm glad that you mentioned the 1960 election fraud by the Daily Machine. And it's a very good example. And I think that one thing, and this is something that concerns me, is when people lie once, people assume, okay, there was never any election fraud. So then JFK entirely won legitimately. JFK lied about a missile gap with the Soviets in the 1960s. So people don't believe that the Soviets had more nukes and missiles in the 70s. They don't believe that the Russians have more missiles today because JFK lied. It becomes a boy who cried wolf. Our election integrity is critical, and Congress and the state legislatures have to work on that. I think this is where we should agree that everything should be done to ensure the fairest possible elections. I do agree that there is a vulnerability with the mail-in votes. And there have been cases that appear to be isolated where people engaged in fraud and criminal activities regarding mail-in ballots. As Yadira correctly said, it's just very, very doubtful that it could have swayed the election. And there's so many just brazen lies by the people supporting Trump with this election and with everything else, including QAnon conspiracies. And a lot of it seems to be aimed at destroying Americans' trust in our democratic process. It's toxic. And
again, there are like two facts or several facts can be true at the same time. That doesn't undermine my premise or my thesis at all. Yes, there are QAnon conspiracies. Some are based in facts, some are completely fraudulent and nonsensical. Okay, I just want to focus on the facts. Okay, I forgot what your major was, Michael. I think it was economics, but nonetheless, you went to the University of Chicago, right? Okay, you're an educated man. Okay, I went to the University of Pennsylvania. Okay, I received honors in philosophy, politics, economics. Any such individual, such as you and me, should know that whenever there's a close election and any precinct shows one candidate receiving more than 86% of the vote, that is a marker for fraud. Okay, whenever any such candidate receives over 90% of the vote, that is at minimum a very, very serious marker for fraud, if not a statistical guarantee of fraud. You have hundreds of precincts in this election where Joe Biden got over 90% of the vote and dozens where he got over 96% of the vote. That does not make statistical sense.
All right, Michael, briefly answer that because I want to introduce a slight different topic within the discussion, please.
I think because we're stuck, we totally disagree on this one point, and we are not going to agree today. I think I hate the expression we have to agree to disagree, but we're not going to about these irregularities. Simply, David and I disagree that there were these huge statistical anomalies. I have looked at the analysts by experts who I do not believe are partisan motivated and biased and out to get Trump. I do not believe they exist. David keeps asserting they exist. I find that highly plausible because of Republican official statements, including Senator.
There are many analysts who have reiterated what I just told you. I don't know which you can choose to listen to which analysts you choose.
This kind of has to do with what I wanted to read. Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, the National Association of Secretaries of State, the National Association of State Election Directors, and members of the election infrastructure sector coordinating council filed a joint statement. They called the 2020 election the most, quote, most secure in American history. And part
that was a misquote, Yadira. Okay, this has been discussed ad nauseum on all channels. That was a misquote. That was in the context of foreign hacking. Okay, that does nothing to do with absentee ballots. That was
remember that they mentioned the team.
Lies. All the people he appointed in Homeland Security, his Secretary of Defense, have all said he's a threat to our democratic system. From Mattis, they're all warning Rex Tillerson. All of the former living Secretary of Defenses, Secretaries of Defense, Cohen, Cheney, Rumsfeld, every single one of them took out a letter saying that Trump was going to have the military intervene in elections. But the people from Homeland Security said that this election was the fairest, most transparent. We do have to worry about foreign threats, of course, and computerized systems. But
there's no such monolith as all the people in Homeland Security, Michael. You know that. Secondly, I saw the video which you're referencing, and that was a reference to foreign hacking and foreign interference. That was not a reference to Ebola terrorists filling out absentee ballots by the millions all across this country.
David, I believe related. Why did Trump have 5 secretaries of Homeland Security? 5. Why did he have to fire 5? 5 secretaries of Homeland Security.
That is not within the purview of this conversation, Michael. Donald Trump has personality issues that rub people the wrong way. He's fired many people in his private life. He's fired many people in his political life. That's nothing to do with this conversation.
And I'll say he's a liar. And you're saying his lies are true.
So let's talk about lying. You know, we've touched upon, and I wish we had 2 more hours to actually give you plenty of evidence. We've touched upon ways in which the outcome of this election could have been illegally rigged. But the great irony in this election is that the legal, albeit unethical, but the legal means in which or through which this election may have been rigged, or I believe was rigged, are far more profound, far more devastating, and have far more long-term consequences to our democracy than the respective illegal ways. And I'm referring to media suppression of fact. I'm referring to media and big tech censorship, most specifically to the Hunter Biden laptop, but there are many other elements of this election and news thereof that they suppressed. Okay, the Hunter Biden laptop was explosive. Okay, we could go into the details if you want, but you could Google it. I'll spare you some of the graphic ones. But in any event, the Hunter Biden laptop not only incriminates Hunter Biden in terms of drug possession, drug use, transporting drugs internationally across state line, but most importantly, it relatively indicts Joe Biden and Jim Biden in terms of all of the above and others, milking the office of the vice president, both during and immediately after Joe Biden's occupancy of the vice presidency of the United States of America. And there's damning evidence, both in the laptop and both in terms of the testimony of the former business partner, Tony Bobulinski. Okay, and here's the point. Okay, so Facebook and Twitter not only use their quote unquote fact checkers, their anonymous, lovely fact checkers whose identity we'll never know, to say this is not true or this may be questioned. They actually suppressed, they actually canceled the New York Post account. The New York Post, one of the most longest standing papers or periodicals in this country's history. They were not even allowed to post for 2 weeks, 2 critical weeks of this election. Polls since the election have shown, Michael and Yadira, that at least 1 out of 6 voters for Joe Biden would either not have voted for a third party, or voted for Donald Trump if only they would have known about the contents of the Hunter Biden laptop, which they could not have known because they didn't watch the 2 or 3 channels that were talking about it. And the mainstream media.
But that still goes into a different topic where we can discuss.
Okay,
but that doesn't really put into that's not really related to whether or not the election was.
Yes, it does.
Yeah.
What is rigged
no, but
mean? No.
That's already within. You're talking about. Do we have an informed citizenry? That's somewhat related, but it doesn't really end up in voter fraud.
No, that's not fair. That's not a fair criticism. Let Michael talk first.
News out, former KGB agent came out and said today, and by the way, all the evidence supports this, is consistent with it, that Trump in '87, when he took the KGB-sponsored trip to Moscow, was their greatest dream, because he took out ads bashing President Reagan's foreign and trade policy using their talking points. And by the way, those talking points that the U.S. is the laughingstock of the world, he's continued on. He uses his campaign. He took out ads, New York Times, Washington Post, find it on Google search, you'll see, signed Donald Trump. And that was after he took a trip to Moscow. Now, he might have believed their lines, their BS lines. It was Russia-Soviet propaganda. But he continued to say this, attack NATO, attack our trade alliances. And this is true. And it was in Business Insider, among other newspapers, that the KGB agent, by the way, which is not credible by itself, but what did Donald Trump say in the 80s? That the Soviet ambassador sponsored the trip because he loved how beautiful his buildings are. But he has been attacking NATO and all the trade organizations and the US-sponsored global system that the Soviet KGB was devoted to destroy since '87. Now, I think on some levels, he may believe it. On some levels, they were cleverly concocted by KGB in '87 because they're believable, but I would argue distortions. They wanted to undermine Americans' faith in America's global role. They wanted to undermine our faith in democratic and capitalist and economic systems. And so, by the way, that's come out too. And you're talking about one laptop from President Biden's son, who does have a troubled history. He does. And he did have a position that he got partly because his father was vice president.
Exclusively, but go on.
Well, it's a little bit of name recognition. It's very common. It almost always happens because if your father's president and somebody says they'll hire you because they want your name on the door, And, you know, people don't usually say no. It doesn't. But
it even happens in Hollywood. The daughters and sons and nephews of certain actors and producers also.
That is not relevant. This is a public office that was milked for millions of dollars.
As it's not, I mean, compared to the things that Trump and his children were doing, I mean, come on, the stuff at the Trump Hotel in DC, I mean, it's really ludicrous. I mean, he promised to basically divest himself from his businesses. He never really did, give up control. I mean, he was scheming with the Ukrainians to get dirt on the Bidens in the first place.
Okay, but here's the thing. If you were to post what you just said on Facebook, not only would you have been censored, there would not have been a sticker or a fact-checker disclaimer next to your post. The New York Post not only didn't have or would have had a disclaimer, they were banned, they were censored. And as a result, material information was denied to millions of voters who otherwise would not have voted for Joe Biden. And that alone would have ensured that Donald Trump would have been reelected. And that's relevant.
It's a possibility.
We have to look at the fairness of what were intended by Google and Facebook to mediate a Russian orchestrated campaign in 2016 of misinformation, which is actually classic back to the Soviets. You know, you talk about people left, right, knee-jerk reactions. People think because Joseph McCarthy was a liar who falsely accused people who are innocent, there was no such thing as Russian spies. And we know that there were. So people have these extreme reactions. It's basically throwing the baby out with the bathwater. And, you know, I mean, there may be people in Silicon Valley or special social networking companies that have liberal biases. I mean, I hate the word liberal and conservative because then people get all tribal. And it's a strange thing that Donald Trump, who always bashed Reagan and Bush and gave money to Bill Clinton, people support him, whatever crazy thing he says, if they identify as Republican. Our politics have turned tribal. They no longer have like rationality. And if he ran as a Democrat, we'd have Democrats saying, yes, Republicans are pedophiles and crazy QAnon conspiracies. There's this tribal element to our partisan politics, but I think you raise valid points that, I mean, it's unfortunate, like the hateful nature that a partisan politics has come to. I think that they throw out the baby with the bathwater, but we do have a little bit of an extraordinary situation. The Russian bots are very good at distributing false information. That's part of Russia's hybrid warfare. They're waging
which
war.
Then get picked up by the likes of Marjorie Taylor Greene. So.
Oh, they love her, but you know, also Tulsi Gabbard, by the way. Tulsi Gabbard happened to run as a Democrat, but they love her as well. And her statements were completely outlandish. And Hillary Clinton said that she was probably a Russian asset, and people basically, well, it seems like it, and people knee-jerk reacted. No, but there is grounds to believe that her statements are outlandish. Her statements are outlandish. She blames us. She sides with Putin, who's a mass murderer. Look at all the killings he did in Chechnya. He basically bombed Grozny, Chechnya, to the ground. In the 1990s, that was the most brutal bombing in the world, was by Putin. We didn't say anything, largely because he controlled 10,000 nuclear weapons. And right now, he has 1,600 nukes pointed at our cities. But she supports Putin. Putin is a mass murderer.
Sure, but I just think that it was Hillary Clinton, when she just called her that, I mean, not only made her more popular, but I also think that Hillary Clinton shouldn't have just said for so long that President Trump was an illegitimate president, because I feel like that kind of that is going off the rails in another direction when she said, like, and also Carter, I believe that Jimmy Carter as well did not think that this was 2016 election was legitimate, and Hillary Clinton, when she just insists for so long that the Russians practically put Trump, in other words, I don't think that's the kind of direction that we should be going in.
I don't think you're being entirely fair. She came to inauguration, and it was President Bush sitting next to her when he heard that weird inauguration speech by President Trump, said that's some weird blank. I don't think I can say what he said. And Hillary Clinton heard. You can see how Bill Clinton, by the way, George W. Bush, and Barack Obama, they all get along. Jimmy Carter is not quite in that group either. After his president, he became kind of an outlier in things he said. To question the legitimacy of a president presidential election is dangerous. I don't think that Hillary Clinton quite said that, but I think that maybe President Gore a couple times after a very close election that was partly settled by U.S. Supreme Court, he may have slightly crossed the line. I know he one time said he'd been elected president. He said that
Michael, you could go. Hillary Clinton referred to Donald Trump as an illegitimate president several times on several major different news networks.
I think that it's a fair criticism of her. It's a dangerous territory to cross.
That would be the word, yes.
I mean, well, and we're seeing the effects of it, but she wasn't trying to bring down our democratic system.
And am I trying to bring down the democratic system?
But you know, in October of 2016, Trump starts saying, because the polls suggested he'd lose, it's a rigged system. He said our economic system, he starts to spew out is the core of global corruption is in the United States. He started to compare the United States to a third world country. This is October 2016. And he said that the election was rigged, October 2016. And so he was attacking it because he thought it would lose. And one of the reasons he's seeming very strongly upset about this rhetoric is this is a pattern with him of attacking our system at its core. Partly for selfish reasons and partly, God knows. I mean,
again, all those facts can be true simultaneously, Michael. I don't know why you're not parsing this better. Yes, he was right to some extent when he said that the Democrat primary in 2016 was rigged against Bernie Sanders. Now, you could say that the superdelegates were well known beforehand, but everybody knew from the very beginning that whoever was going to run up against Hillary Clinton was going to run up against those superdelegates. They were pretty much in her pocket from the beginning. So in essence, that is a rigging system. I'm not done.
After Bernie, he feels to burn. Why is his rhetoric so much stronger and more extreme than Bernie Sanders, who appears to be the victim of it?
People make their deals, Michael. And first of all, Bernie Sanders extracted a lot of pain out of Hillary Clinton. You may have noticed that the entire first day of the Democrat convention that year was dedicated to Bernie Sanders. So he got some of his payback. But I mean, there's also, what's her name? Donna Brazile and Debbie Wasserman Schultz working to rig a debate against Bernie. I mean, this stuff goes on and has gone on many levels, but this should not, none of this should concern you as much as the statistics that are very disconcerting in this election. Again, we know Donald Trump increased his turnout amongst Blacks, Hispanics, and Jewish American swing states. Okay, we saw his rallies. We saw the total lack of enthusiasm for Joe Biden. You couple that with an exorbitant abundance of absentee ballots as a percentage of Joe Biden's returns. You couple that with these statistical utter anomalies bordering on the impossible. There's something very wrong here.
I love you for hours, but I know Yadira wants to ask us other things. And if we could extend the show to 4 hours or go back to this, we'll argue more. I disagree with David. I mean, it just simply, I find it implausible, his argument, as I said before. I just do. I disagree with you that there's major statistical anomalies. I entirely agree with what Yadira said. There's no evidence of something that would tilt the election. Was there any, I'm not saying perfectly clean. People are not perfectly clean. I disagree with you, David. I disagree with you completely about statistical anomalies. I just don't believe it because the people making those arguments are making, I mean, honestly, Giuliani has made some of the craziest arguments across the board. It is, what isn't consistent, you're asking about parsing, is that the only people who know about this conspiracy are people who are basically gone completely insane and saying all kinds of crazy things. And so if people who are lifelong Republicans, serious and credible, say that there is no significant evidence, and then you have Giuliani who's butt-calling people at 3 a.m. with really strange things. I mean, the number of strange things that have come from Giuliani and every single one of these lawyers making these claims, just strange things across the board. So I don't think...
These are all ad hominem attacks, Michael. I expect more from you. Okay, again, you can dislike people and say they happen to be right on a particular day at the same time.
I mean, there are people, I won't even say the horrible conspiracy theories. They present very detailed facts, and it's very specific about things that I cannot tell you the votes in a certain county. I can tell you that all the series, Republican and Democrat, election experts say that there are no anomalies. And the guy with tinfoil walking down the street, if he tells you whatever, buy the stock, you don't, because he's wearing tinfoil. So, yes, if you're saying that Hillary Clinton didn't pass the bar first time, or Nixon got caught with Watergate, that's just attacking him as a person. But when everything people are saying is nonsensical, and that's what we're talking about with these people, that they're just spewing out nonsense and lies. Look up nonsense.
Am I one of these people? And have I spewed a lie in this entire debate? I don't know who these people are.
But you're not a career analyst of Georgia elections and Michigan elections.
Oh, really?
You're not.
Let me ask you, Michael, if instead of 95%, these precincts had 100% turnout for Joe Biden, what would you say about that?
No, I mean, there wasn't any of the, there just weren't those type of anomalies. The turnout was higher, and that seems to have been pandemic inspired. There were strong feelings.
Thank you. Pandemic, no. Absentee ballot inspired, because the pandemic opened the door to absentee ballot fraud and manipulation. That's my argument, and the statistics bear that out. No, I don't know why everyone's afraid to have a congressional commission like we had for 9/11 and bear out all the evidence.
No, but statistics tell us that if there was massive fraud, we would have discovered some of it. And
how would you discover it? How would you discover that some old lady who's half senile had her absentee ballot taken out of her mailbox, because we always know when the absentee ballot's about to drop, and filled out by whoever happened to fill it out? You don't know.
But you're saying, doesn't that argument also work against your claim? You're saying, how would you discover it? Well, then how did you discover it?
By the numbers.
What? The numbers? But
Yadira.
If you would want the Biden presidency to effectively undo everything that Trump did, you would find a way, if it really is a grand conspiracy like that, you would find a way to also have absolute control of the Senate and not leave it to perhaps a runoff election in Georgia, where they had to spend so much more money and send it such a strong team of activists on the ground. I mean, the Democratic volunteers were knocking on thousands of doors a day. So they really put in the labor, and parallel to Biden doing really good in certain districts that I agree that.
By the way, the Republicans were knocking down more doors because they were less afraid of the pandemic. You had
that too.
Why Trump's turnout was as big as Biden's turnout, that excess people. But I think you make an excellent point. How does David know about this conspiracy and the courts don't, that he's able to get this absolute evidence?
It's not that the courts don't. No judge wants to be responsible for overturning an election, especially when the other side is staffed by the Antifas and anarchists of the world, who just assassinated 25 people in riots and cost billions of dollars and burned down significant percentages of major cities.
Who's staffed by people and anarchists?
But
were you not privy to the riots that occurred this past summer, Michael?
No, I mean, some crazy people in Portland and Seattle. What does that have? I mean,
crazy people by the tens of thousands who would not be all too happy with any judge, Democrat or Republican, who were to, in their minds, ostensibly overturn an entire election.
Okay,
right, but we've actually been talking for an hour now, so I want to introduce at least two last questions before either one of us decides to ditch. So the Organization of American States, La OEA, they because we actually have international observers during our elections. At first, they wanted to bring in 500 special delegates to supervise our elections, but because of the pandemic, I guess, it ended up being reduced to 28 observers from 13 different countries. I understand that not all states wanted to participate, so that's kind of like questionable. But the reality is that this same organization, which tells us that the elections in Venezuela were no good, they said that the elections in the United States were actually pretty good, and they said that their preliminary conclusion was they had their list of criticisms. Of course, they talked about the problems with political polarization, which sometimes, when it's too polarized, sometimes that kind of becomes a big obstacle in the way of having an informative discussion on anything. Access to voter registration was unequal, and U.S. campaign finance laws are easy to circumvent. We know that. And 10 million voters received automated disinformation phone calls. I think those are very dangerous because we saw in this election that many people were getting phone calls that were just saying like really, really stupid and actual defamation against certain candidates. That's no good for the well-being of a democracy. But I'm worried that in this grand discussion, I know I said 2 questions, but I guess we could sum that into one topic. We've seen now how as a result of the 2020 election, we've seen also that Republicans are organizing themselves to make voting a little bit more difficult to people. I mean, in Georgia alone, they've introduced, I think it was like almost 10 bills. A recent study by the Brennan Center for Justice found that in total, across 28 states, there have been 106 bills, and they essentially end up restricting access to the ballot in comparison to other years. Like, for instance, in Georgia, there's one of the bills are trying to get voters to submit physical copies of photo identification twice so they can vote by mail. And they're trying to come up with so many ways. Do you guys think that the elections are for the midterms coming up and then our next presidential elections? What kind of political atmosphere do you guys think domestically we are going to be facing? Because I don't think these problems are going away. Like, it just seems to be getting worse and worse and worse.
These problems could go away if we were above board about it. Maybe I'm wrong, Michael, right? Maybe I'm wrong, Yadira. What is wrong with us finding out? What is wrong with having a congressional commission with maybe CNN won't show up, but have C-SPAN show up, have anyone who's honest and decent, maybe have Fox show up, and actually air every single hour, air it on the internet, live stream every single hour for however many days, 10 days, 30 days, 50 days, I don't care. Have every single person, by the way, there are hundreds of independents and Democrats who have testified to voter irregularities, problems with scanners, jamming, things of that nature, intimidation of Republican poll watchers, et cetera, not to mention the statistics that I mentioned. Have a public analysis or analyses of all of the above, have questions asked and answered on camera for all the American people to see. That is the best way. There's no disinfectant like sunlight, okay? That is the best way to disinfect the system and to disabuse people of any illusions they may have. Those illusions are wrong.
But just so that little commission, just so it doesn't end up being something that's just completely organized by Republicans aimed at supporting Republicans, you would need to also
if you want it to be, no.
You would need to introduce other topics there as well,
organized,
such as gerrymandering, such as voter suppression tactics. You would introduce everything. Even perhaps seeing how money in politics is destroying democracy. Like, it can't be something hyper partisan, because in this political atmosphere, it's just not going to go anywhere if clearly we can see your partisan markings.
I mean, yeah, I think a lot of people may be pleasantly surprised. The midterm elections in less than 2 years may actually go very well. There's a few people, demagogues, Republican, Democrat, Trump is definitely one of them, who have really inflamed things, and they're really, really toxic. Trump is in Mar-a-Lago in Florida. Hopefully his Twitter account is deleted, thank God, actually in this case. Toxic, divisive rhetoric here. I think American political and legal and judicial systems are really, really transparent by nature usually, sometimes too much. When you have a court case, it could be something embarrassing, a false allegation, whatever. Court records tend to be, and you wonder, a divorce case, sometimes they end up public as well. Freedom of Information Act. We're actually in a very transparent country. There are safeguards, election judges from both major parties. We can have a 9/11 commission. It was bipartisan. It was very, very well done. CNN will be there. It's not in a conspiracy to cover up anything. Fox News will be there. I think that Trump was a catalyst for a very toxic partisan. It was bad before it got worse. And I think we need to try to end the gotcha politics of the Democratic and Republican parties. I get this hate mail from the Democrats, from the Republicans. So-and-so is trying to destroy democracy. So-and-so is trying to kill workers, whatever. And it's exaggerations. It's looking at the worst. There are disagreements. You've raised legitimate issues, Yadira, but they're not entirely consensus. They're very logical. Not everyone agrees. You can have logical arguments. The parties largely disagree on it. Election fraud, virtually everyone except somebody completely corrupt is against. David, if somebody's calling you up trying to sell ballots, please call the FBI, please call the Florida police. I mean, I'm concerned if people are telling me that the people who are offering to kill people, for example, which is even more serious, then you've got to call the police. It's your duty as a citizen. I mean, it kind of reminds me of the logical argument you said. If David has this solid evidence, why didn't he present it to the media? Why didn't he present it on Fox News? Why didn't he give it to the court? There doesn't seem to be anyone who's able to file in court and say, I mean, if somebody's threatening, if Antifa's threatening to assassinate you, David, I will help you. We need to find out about that as well. I mean,
thanks for your generosity, Mike. Michael, the short answer is they had limited time after the election. All the information was flowing fast and furious. Only now can we calm down and in a calm and collected manner assess all the information. Okay, so obviously Giuliani made mistakes. Everybody made mistakes, but they only had to be right a few times for the thesis to be right. Now I want to ask you both, Yadira and Michael, do you believe all 1,000 to 2,000 people who signed those affidavits claiming voter fraud and irregularity at poll sites all across this country are liars?
Attention seeking.
I'm sorry?
Attention seeking.
So they're liars, so they should go to jail. You believe they should go to jail?
I understand that some of them actually, when they were confronted by the FBI, actually changed their testimonies.
What, sorry?
I understood that some of them, when confronted by the FBI, actually changed their testimonies.
5 out of the 2,000, correct.
Surprise by surprise. I mean,
wouldn't this be a perfect opportunity to have a commission and have all, except for maybe 5 you just mentioned, appear before Congress, testify under oath before Congress, and lay out that evidence for the American people to judge? I'm not interested in personalities. I'm interested in the statistical and fair functionality of our democracy, and we do not see that in this last election.
But Donald Trump was claiming 2016 was rigged and there was no pandemic, no huge bail-in campaign. I mean, why did
I'm not saying he's right or wrong. We know of that case in Pennsylvania where that woman had the results overturned. The election was actually rigged against her, and the votes were reversed. And only after, because it was a small township, they were able to call all 120 people who lived in town, and they found out that it was rigged. So these things can happen.
The greatest level of transparency, the greatest level of safeguards, the greatest level of auditing, and this I'll entirely agree with Yadira. And I think we need education. I think that there's a lot of safeguards already in the system. I think that there was a lot of checking of mail-in ballots, much more than, David, you're admitting. And people just need to be educated and understand. You know, I think that states run by Republicans are often incredibly good at administering elections fairly. You might disagree with the rules they set up sometimes, Yadira, but as far as making sure and weeding out bad ballots, I think they're very good. That's actually the irony, for example, with the housing crisis, is Republicans tend to favor, obviously, less regulations of business, but it turned out that when mortgages were under state rather than federal regulation, the states that were run by Republicans were tougher. So nationally, the Republicans in Congress and the Bush administration said they didn't want state regulation. They wanted the federal government to preempt, in the housing crisis. But in states run by Republicans, they were very strict on the banks, on the mortgages, and they did a better job, and they had less housing fraud, and they also had less people getting mortgages they shouldn't have. So I actually do have a lot of faith in the election process in Georgia. And I saw these people, basically the governor of Georgia is facing death threats. So is the Secretary of State. We've never really seen this, almost never seen this before in the United States. And I have a lot of faith in them. And it really, really troubles me that their name is getting slandered. And we've had this pattern for 4 to 5 years when a Republican politician says something that he or she believes in, and it doesn't go along with Donald Trump's bizarre narrative, they face death threats. There are news anchors in Fox News who've been receiving death threats from Trump supporters because they're reporting on the news. And that's why I feel very strongly, as far as transparency, safeguards for election. We can never have too much safeguards. Transparency can sometimes actually violate people's privacy. For example, we have to protect who you voted for. If you voted for Bernie Sanders and your boss doesn't like Bernie Sanders, if you voted for Donald Trump and your boss doesn't like Donald Trump, if you voted for Hillary Clinton, you're supposed to your vote. So there is a little bit of a struggle. We can't be perfect, but it's also a little bit, you're in a college football team or an NFL football team, maybe even a Super Bowl, and you think that the ref didn't call it right. There is an appeals process, and you ultimately lose an appeals process, or it doesn't change the verdict who won the game. At some point, once you go through the process, if you keep claiming you won the Super Bowl, you won the Rose Bowl, you're just nothing more than a sore loser.
Okay, I mean, in the appeals process, you see the whole video and in its entirety, and people have the time and the collectivity to sit down and analyze it objectively. That did not happen.
College football. There's some practical, because it's a judgment call. There is. You're correct, it's limited time. And there is a limit to how much, I mean, even in a criminal case, there's a limit to what the appellate court can overrule the findings of the judge and jury, which sat with the trial. Appellate court, usually federal and state, can't simply say, I disagree with the jury, or I can't disagree with the judge. I assume that the benefit of the doubt is with the defendant, who faces imprisonment, or in very, very rare cases, death. But that's almost gone away right now statistically. But even in their criminal cases and civil cases, appellate courts can't completely overrule juries and judges. That's just a practical thing, because everyone can have a slightly different interpretation of events. And unfortunately, you can go back and forth and you have a seesaw. By the way, the president, and I don't think Donald Trump ever accepted this, the US president is supposed to have very limited power, and it's supposed to be a limited term for 4 to 8 years. And ideally in design, it's not supposed to be life or death, coup. And by the way, in general, people, I think, really drastically overinterpret how big of a difference there was between Obama and Bush. Like, I think compared to other countries, our political parties are closer, but sometimes Americans act like it's the opposite is the case. I mean, our election process, you can't, if one guy wins by 51%, you can't say that he's a million times more entitled to the presidency than another guy.
I think we've had a very good discussion. We're gonna cut it, I guess, at 1 hour and 20 minutes. I like how we all agreed on the fashion statement of wearing slightly off the loose shirt. That was a bizarre coordination. Okay, but really, just a quick answer, because I'm actually curious on this one. I didn't plan for this one, but what do you guys think is the future of Donald Trump? Because some see him as like a political powerhouse who might actually create the Patriots Party. Some say that he's actually going to win the election in 2024. Some are saying that he's just going to quietly go away and just go back to the business world and is only going to occasionally pop up to support Republican candidates. What do you see the future of Donald Trump? I mean, we have to mention him. I mean, Michael, you mentioned him. Obviously, this whole election revolved around him. I mean, we could even sometimes argue that Biden could have won over many people only because he was the against Trump option. So what is the future of Donald Trump?
So if the 2024 elections are completely fair, honest, transparent, and void of the elements we had just seen, and I'm no doubt in my mind have seen, Michael may not choose to see it, and Donald Trump does indeed choose to run against Joe Biden, or maybe Kamala Harris if Joe Biden decides he's too old. And he may in fact I am almost certain Donald Trump will beat that Democrat candidate. Now, in reference to your previous question, which we didn't answer, the short answer is we have to do away with the current absentee ballot regime. And I would have said this 20 years ago when I was a Democrat, okay? Absentee ballots should be there for people who are truly absentee, who are serving the military, who are on vacations that were predetermined many months ago, who have a physical handicap, people who have real excuses, okay? No one in either party that I know of has ever said that absentee ballots are less prone to fraud than voting in person. Everyone knows they're more prone to fraud. It's only a question, we only disagree on the extent to which fraud has been committed, okay? So if everybody wants more, a greater sense of integrity in our electoral process and our democracy, then we have to greatly mitigate the use of absentee ballots before 2024. That's the first thing. The second thing is we have to agree in a bipartisan commission that censorship shall not be tolerated. Okay, what Facebook and Twitter did really amounts to gross in-kind contributions to Joe Biden. If you extrapolate that to a local politics analogy, if Michael and I run against each other for mayor of the city of Miami or Miami-Dade County, and there's one major paper, let's say it's the Miami Herald, and I have to pay $1,000 a pop for an ad every month in the Miami Herald, but the Miami Herald gives Michael a free ad every month, not to mention endorses him on the editorial page, that's an in-kind contribution that both the Miami Herald and Michael Szanto would have to report. Okay, Twitter and Facebook never reported these in-kind contributions.
Huge benefits from Twitter, actually, up until he was finally banned, and it was largely false information, disinformation, misinformation.
Right. Well, okay, we call it disinformation, but if you were to call that disinformation or that platform for disinformation would have been available to both candidates. I'm talking about a case where the public is deprived of information because an entire candidate's narrative is obleted. Okay, it's deleted, it's censored, it's blacklisted.
We were facing insurrectionists against the capital for the first time in the history of our country. And so
you faded out, Michael.
Yeah, could you repeat that?
Faced with insurrectionists who attacked our capital for the first time in our country's history.
I failed to see the analogy.
That's why Facebook and Twitter took an extraordinary response to an extraordinary circumstance.
No, I'm talking about the Hunter Biden laptop story a month or so prior to that. I'm talking about during the election. Again, 1 out of 6 Biden supporters would not have voted for Biden had they known the truth. Okay, that is disgraceful.
That's really
if all voters had known the truth, irrespective of everything you and I have said today, Donald Trump would be the president today. And that is not right.
It's a possibility, but it can't be guaranteed either.
It is a statistic.
I actually think that while Trump,
even if 1 out of 10 of them had not voted for Biden, 1 out of 6 would have not voted for Biden.
But it can't be guaranteed. Like, I actually think
the election towards Donald Trump in 2016 by giving an announcement that turned out to be nothing. He said he was reopening the case of the Hillary emails, and it turned out to be nothing there.
Whoa. Just because Hillary Clinton didn't go to jail doesn't mean there was nothing there. There's plenty there. Hillary Clinton got off scot-free.
There really wasn't. There really wasn't with her emails. It was the most exaggerated. Colin Powell used Gmail. She used an email server. They're both insecure.
Did Colin Powell acid wash 7 phones?
By the way, classified stuff does not go through email. They both, every Secretary of State and anyone in national security has a separate system for secure stuff.
Did Colin Powell have a server in his bathroom?
He had a
Gmail.
He used Gmail.
She also had another server for a BlackBerry, so I don't remember all the details, but she had one of her servers in her house in a bathroom.
Okay, so I'm not going to argue with where she positions her email servers. Basically, she came from the Senate, and in the 90s, the computer systems in Capitol Hill were so bad, many of the representatives and senators had their own email servers. Part of this was kind of stupid of her, by the way. She did this because this was normal in Capitol Hill. That's part of it. But all the secure email, classified, sensitive stuff is supposed to be not through State Department email or any email through secure systems. The problem here is State Department is particularly sloppy with classified, secured, sensitive stuff. And there is stuff. This is one of the things that here and in other places is revealed. State Department people, career State Department people, not just Hillary Clinton, was a political appointee, were sending stuff by email that they shouldn't. So there were some sensitive classified stuff, but it was a minority. It was mostly like, do you want to have lunch? Do you want to have lunch with the ambassador, whatever. The sensitive, secure stuff was supposed to go through a different server. Both Colin Powell and Hillary Clinton decided to use their own email system. In the case of Colin Powell, it was Gmail. Hillary Clinton had a server. There might have been some sneaky motives. She might have been trying to hide something. I think many people have things to hide. But what's crazy is Ivanka Trump was using Gmail too. And this is after the mean pinnacle.
That's not the argument for lock her up, lock her up. The argument is that her cell phones and laptops and those of her staff were subpoenaed by Congress. It is a federal crime to acid wash and take a hammer the evidence that's subpoenaed by Congress.
This stuff had to be destroyed also for national security purposes. I mean, I mean, you know, the people in the Trump administration did not cooperate with any congressional subpoenas. I mean, it's suddenly people are looking at the sanctity of.
There was also FBI evidence. If congressional subpoena isn't strong enough, it was also FBI evidence. It was also subpoenaed by the FBI, but that's fine.
You know, I mean, okay, that's a hint of obstruction of justice if it's an FBI investigation. But I don't think that's what people thought when they said lock her up, lock her up. And it was the very honorable General Michael, convicted felon. Oh my God, I'm forgetting.
Michael Flynn.
Michael Flynn, who then basically was yelling at somebody at the last week of the President Trump administration to declare martial law and overturn the election. Michael Flynn was doing very scary stuff. Michael Flynn's very scary. I mean, he was apparently trying to bully military officials to try to declare martial law. And, you know, used to be talk of martial law in the United States were conspiracy theories. We have these crazies like Michael Flynn who was actually doing that. So in 2016, kind of violating military protocol, he was saying, lock her up, lock her up. A former Secretary of State, a former First Lady, a former U.S. Senator. Very strange stuff. It's not Republican. It's not conservative. It's just crazy stuff. And I think that people, I hope this fades away. I think Donald Trump has major legal and financial problems. He faces potentially criminal charges from the state of New York, federal. People may decide they don't want to pursue it because it's politically sensitive. Maybe that's more healing. He's going to be known as the worst president in American history.
Oh,
I think your opponent disagrees wholeheartedly.
I disagree. The worst president in American history who actually ended the Israeli-Arab conflict. I would love to be that worst president in American history.
There is a fundamental misunderstanding of the Arab-Israeli conflict. You know, in 2006, the Saudi general said they wished that Israel had destroyed Hezbollah. So, you know, Qatar opened up a trade office in Tel Aviv in 1995. Now, unfortunately, they turned against Israel, started to support Hamas, and Saudi Arabia almost invaded them. So there's, you know, ups and downs here. But that kind of statement, frankly, is said by people of no understanding of Middle Eastern history. I mean, I'm sorry, that's just craziness.
Really?
Yeah, that is craziness because Sadat, the leader of Egypt, sacrificed his life to make peace with Israel in 1999.
And Michael, you're talking down to me. I've written books on these topics. Okay, there was no essence of systemic peace between Israel and its Arab neighbors until the last few years. Okay?
No, not true. They had trade offs in the United Arab Emirates and Qatar back in the 90s. The big deals were with Jordan in 1995, King Hussein, King Abdullah. You know, it's a slow process.
Listen, one does not preclude the other. You keep on thinking all facts are mutually exclusive. Of course, there was progression, but the fulcrum in that progression happened under Donald Trump.
No, they were very incremental. They were very incremental in nature.
So thank you so much for hosting us, Yadira. Thank you, Michael.
Thank you, and thank you both for engaging in this. Very productive. I mean, considering just how different the opinions were raging today, it's, you know, it's wonderful news that we managed to keep it all so cordial and friendly and productive. You know, if only Washington, D.C. were like this, exactly. Right? And the best thing about it is that we're discussing politics without masks. So that's also a bonus, you know, actually get to see the person behind the mask. I hope this happens again.
Thank you. Bye.
Okay. Take care, y'all. Bye.